Good morning, everyone. I hope you can hear me. I've just reconfigured audio and video, so that's why I'm starting a little late today. I'm sorry about that. So as promised, today we'll continue studying some very relevant client-side technologies, including cascading style sheets and web forms, a fundamental piece of user interaction in the web. So for starters, we're gonna see about CSS. We're gonna start, as always, with a little history about CSS, and then with the features, then with the most important, most relevant features possibly for us engineers, because normally when we work with CSS, there's someone else doing the CSS, possibly a designer, someone who knows about aesthetics or colors or textures or, you know, someone with a skill. So, okay, I'll switch now to my desktop. Just a second. Okay, very good. So I'll jump to the part about basic CSS. You can say hi on the chat. Huh? I see there are a few people connected. But I will really appreciate if you could just say hi, just to feel in company, you know. Otherwise, I feel too lonely here doing my lecture and feeling like no one is listening. Well, let's get started with basic CSS. So about CSS, back in the mid 2000s. Possibly even in the early 2000s, the web was pretty much plagued with these memes, these kinds of memes about developers suffering, developers really struggling, trying to apply CSS to the websites. You see that CSS back then was very difficult to use effectively across a variety of different browsers that were available. There was still this arena on the web in which major web browser developers contested each other. You know, we had back then still the situation of Microsoft being getting more and more hegemonic, and the alternative back then, Netscape, then Mozilla, slowly started to gain more traction and adoption. So, well, support for CSS in Internet Explorer that had about 80 to 90% market share wasn't really that good. So many developers suffering due to both CSS inherent difficulties because of how CSS was designed, and also due to web browser bugs and limitations. So you see that back then it was so difficult to have text properly aligned, properly centered vertically. It was very difficult to build a decent layout, you know, a 3-column layout with a header and a footer. That back in the early 2000s, mid 2000s was quite difficult. So, well, about CSS. So CSS is a technology that will allow us to apply style to HTML markup, to HTML elements. In the early days of the web, in the earlier versions of HTML, HTML2, HTML3, well, style was applied by using HTML elements, such as this first example here. We've got a heading 1, and within the heading, we've got a text that says chapter 1. And you see that there's a font tag there, a font element. So those were commonly used with HTML3, HTML2 back in the day. But nowadays, we've got this wonderful technology that is called CSS that will simply allow us to forget about style in the HTML document. We have a clear separation of concerns. The HTML code is intended to allow the developer specifying the document structure, you know. So the document will have a header, the document will have a footer, will have a navigation bar, will have a main section, will have an aside. Within the main section, it will have paragraphs, or it will have headings, you know. So in parallel, in CSS, you will have several rule declarations in which, well, each of these rules will apply to certain elements with certain style definitions. So you see the equivalent CSS to achieve the same color red in the first example, you see below that there's a small style sheet just containing one rule that applies to heading 1. The rule applies to heading 1, then you have sort of a block with curly braces. You open a curly brace, you close the curly brace, and there you have a property which is color. Heading 1 has a property which is a color property, and then you got a value that is the red value. And in that way, you style all H1 elements that are available, sort of available to the style sheet, if you will. So CSS began as early as the mid-90s. Initially, the browser compliance was limited and buggy, as I mentioned before. CSS has evolved over time, as HTML has. And there have been like 3 major versions of CSS. CSS version 1, that had these basic features below, such as font properties, including the typeface and emphasis, colors for text, backgrounds, and other elements, text attributes such as spacing between words, letters, and lines of text, alignment of text, images, tables, etc., margin, border padding, and positioning for most elements, and unique identification and generic classification of groups of attributes. So these are sort of features that we nowadays take for granted. Back then, in the mid-90s, it was certainly difficult for browsers to support this because these were CPU-intensive kind of features. Page rendering consumes CPU, consumes memory, and back then we had underpowered computers, really 486s, even 386s, a few Pentiums. So you can imagine the struggle for a PC to efficiently render a document having a lot of styling. A lot of styling specification through a style sheet. This is the basic style declaration in CSS. You got that, well, a CSS style sheet will be composed of many rules or a rule set. Each of the rules will contain a selector. The selector specifies the HTML elements to which the rule applies, okay? So a selector may be an element, a kind of element, for instance, H1 or a div or paragraph, whatever HTML element, visual element you want to style. Then you got the curly braces, right? You got sort of a block, and within the block you can provide a list of properties for which you want to set the values. The complete example, we could say, it's at the bottom right of this slide. You got an unordered list, which is intended for a navigation bar, and you got that the style applies to this unordered list, also to the list item, and also to the link that's within the navigation bar, right? So this applies to lists and links that are within the navigation bar. And you see that the color of the text is white, the text should be centered, the padding should be 14 pixels, 16 pixels, that is, I think, if I remember correctly, I think that's left top, 14 pixels left, 16 pixels top, or something like that. With no text decorations such as underline or bold. So, this is the way in which you specify rules for your style sheet. I'll see if there are any questions or greetings in the chat. I'm still wondering if the audio quality is sufficiently good, if you can hear me. If there are any issues so far, please let me know. To postergate. Postergate. That sounds like a poltergeist. To postergate. Let's wait until Monday. I'd like to see how are you doing on Monday, and then see if postponing the due date is possible. Okay. Then you got assignment 3. So if we take long on finishing assignment 2, then you'll have less time to finish assignment 3, unfortunately. I believe a weekend to do it, it's not a lot of time. Well, I published this long ago. At least the routing, you could have solved the routing long ago. Also the views, on lab 7, you already did quite a lot about the views. So the views on this assignment are static. are static. At the most, possibly you'll have to render some element, some model. You have to show the properties or the attributes of a model in a page. With Lab 7, you already had the experience to do it. Basically, project assignment 2, you need to apply the same skill set as the Lab 7, mostly. All right, so I'll go back. Selectors. So a selector, as I mentioned, specifies the HTML elements to which you want to apply rules, okay? So there are different kinds of selectors. This has grown quite complex over time. The first 3 selectors I'm showing you here, the element, class, and ID, are the most common. The element selector will apply to all elements of a certain type. For instance, the first example I showed you about the heading 1, well, if you put h1, curly brace, and then put declarations and put another closing curly brace, then that set of rules, that rule in particular with several property value declarations will apply to heading 1 and only heading 1, right? So then you got the possibility to apply styles to a class. So what is a class? In HTML, almost any element will allow you to define a class attribute. So a class attribute is any string, right, that sets the class of the element. It's totally arbitrary. You can choose whatever class name you want for an element. So if you got, for instance, a navigation bar and you want to give it, I don't know, a class to make it look some, I don't know, with a certain background color, right? You simply, to the nav element, to the nav HTML element, you add a class attribute and you put a name for the class attribute. For instance, you want a blue bar, you put blue on it, okay? It's not really the best example because class names should be semantic, should have some semantics in them. The class names should be sort of self-explaining. If you want a class that will be intended for I don't know, ads, for instance. You want some ad placements. So the class name for the items containing the ads should be ads, I don't know, priority ads or low priority ads, for instance. The class name should be self-explaining, should have a semantic. And lastly, about the basic selectors, there's the ID selector. Within an HTML document, you can assign unique IDs to the elements. You can have a div, for instance, with an ID, and you can apply a specific style intended only for the element with that ID. Okay, so summarizing, you got the possibility to define a style for elements of the same type, for elements with the same class, with a single element to a single element with a specific ID. There are other more sort of complex selectors depending on what you want to do. There's a lot of flexibility. You got the combinator selectors that will apply to any descendant of a given element. For instance, if you got, I don't know, a section of your page with a div and the div has some ID and you want to apply the style to the div as well as all the descendants, you got a combinator selector for that. You can apply styles to descendant elements, to child elements, to adjacent siblings, to general siblings, etc. A sibling es en español un hermano. Ya le puedo aplicar un estilo un hermano de mi div y ese hermano puede ser un div, un div adyacente o puede ser un párrafo adyacente. El caso del general es cualquier elemento, el caso del adjacent es del mismo tipo, el caso de un child es un hijo inmediato, un descendiente es un nieto, por ejemplo, ¿ya? O un bisnieto, no sé, la profundidad que pueda haber. Then you got the pseudo class selectors that apply to a certain state. For instance, hyperlinks will have different states. As a link will have a state known as the hover state, the H hover, when you hover the mouse on top. When you hover the mouse pointer on top of the hyperlink, it can change color if you want. Also, when you visit the link can show itself with another color as visited. And also, when a link is being clicked, it can also display a different color. So pseudo class are intended for different element states when the element permits different states. Then you got pseudo element selectors that will apply to a specific part of an element, such as, for instance, the first line of a paragraph, if you want. And then you got the attribute selectors that will select elements based on some attributes value, right? For instance, if a checkbox is marked, then I think the checked property of the checkbox will be changed, or the value property, the checked or the value property will change. So in that case, you can apply a different style depending on the state of the checkbox. Yeah, it's because the checkbox holds a value, right? It's because of the value. You can even do that with a paragraph. If the paragraph has or better with an input, with a text input in a form, for instance. If you're typing an email address and the email address is not valid, you can apply a style using a regular expression if you want. So there are a lot of examples you can see. There are W3 schools about CSS selectors. I strongly recommend that when you study this class, you study the different links that appear in the slides to deepen on each subject. So in CSS, it can happen that more than one rule apply to some element, right? It can happen. It can happen even by accident. Without without careful planification, without careful planning of your style sheet, it can happen that you can have two styles that apply to the same element. So in that case, you'll have two or more competing or conflicting CSS rules to apply to an element. So there's a specificity criteria in CSS that will allow deciding which is the rule that will finally apply. So every selector has its place in a specificity hierarchy. There are 4 categories, from more specific to less specific. The highest priority for styles is for inline styles. We'll see about this in a while, but basically it means that within an element, you can specify a style attribute, and the style attribute can contain a rule, such as you see here. You see that the heading 1 is being applied white as the color property. The FF color is white because it's based on the red, green, and blue color model. FF is hexadecimal for 255, so 255 is the highest intensity of red. Then the second FF, the second byte, FF is 1 byte. The second FF is for the green component of the color, and FF means again 255, which is the highest intensity of green, and then you got the highest intensity of blue. So the highest intensity of red, highest intensity of green, highest intensity of blue will be white. FF is white. And if you got any other color in which the 3 bytes are the same, then you got a grayscale color. Okay, so in this case, you are applying a style directly on the element by specifying the style attribute. This is not a good practice at all. I'll show you about it later on. It's not a good practice at all. You only use it when you want to debug your style sheet, when you want to experiment, for instance, with different style properties, different colors, different typefaces, etc. But it's not common that you use the style attribute. You shouldn't use it. Anyways, the style attribute is the one that has the highest priority in the specificity hierarchy. Then the second level in this hierarchy is for IDs. So if you got different rules that apply to an element, the ID will have precedence over the rules that are below. The rules that are below are then classes, attributes, and pseudo classes. So the ID rule will have a higher precedence than the class. And finally, the least values in the hierarchy are for the elements and pseudo elements. So if you see it bottom up, you'll see that on the bottom there are the most general possible selection rules, and at the top there's the most specific selection rule that applies to an element itself. So there's a way in which you can sort of estimate the specificity of a rule you are defining. So you start at 0 for defining the specificity of a rule. You add 1,000 for style attribute, which is the highest hierarchy there is, so 1,000 is the highest score. Then you add 100 for each ID, then you add 10 for each attribute, class or pseudo class, and 1 for each element name or element or pseudo element. So in the first case, you got H1. In the second case, you got an ID. In the third case, you got style. You got a style which is applied to the heading 1. So the specificity of A is 1 because it refers to the element. The specificity of B is the ID plus the element, so that's 101. And finally, you got the specificity of C, wherein the style is declared as an element attribute. So in that case, it's 1,000. So since 1 is lower than 101, lower than 1,000, the third rule has a greater level of specificity and therefore is applied. So the rule C will precede over B and A. So each element in HTML will define a set of properties that can be customized by using CSS rules. For details on the properties, there are a few summaries online. It's really something, there are many properties that are common to all elements, such as the width, height, padding, margin, etc. All the visual elements will have that properties because of a thing called the box model, we'll review in a minute. So there are properties that are supported by all elements. There are a few specific rules that are supported, for instance, by form elements. And there are some browser or technology specific properties and value generators that are commonly specified by using a vendor prefix. You see below 2 examples about this. First, for WebKit-based browsers, WebKit is a browser technology, a rendering engine technology that was first developed by the KDE open source project, then was embraced by Apple for Safari, then came Google Chrome, and now came Microsoft Edge. So WebKit has pervaded most of the web browser market as a core web browser technology. And to specify, for instance, a linear gradient as the background for some element, there's a property value generator, which is -webkit -linear gradient. That's sort of a function, you know. So it's got the browser prefix on it. That means that it's only compatible with WebKit browsers. And in some cases, well, back in the early 90s or back in the early 2000s, sorry, this was quite a headache for developers because they had to specify custom rules for the different browsers all the time. Luckily, this kind of rules, there are W3C recommendations for this kind of rules, such as the one at the bottom, linear gradient to bottom, blah, blah. So that is a W3C recommendation that is expected to be supported by most browsers, right? So there are times in which browser technology evolves faster than web standards. And in that case, it happens that web vendors, web browser developers will add their own prefix to some property or some property value generator in order to provide the feature. So this is the box model I was talking about a minute ago. You see that in a web page, every element is rendered as a rectangular box. So there's the content at the center, then you got sort of a padding kind of margin. And I don't want to call the padding a margin. The padding is like the space that there's in between the content and the border. That's what the padding is. And finally, you got the margin that separates one element from another, right? So all of these quantities, the padding, the border, the margin, you can customize how much space left, top, right, and bottom you want. So the box model describes how the element's content, padding, border, and margin determine the space occupied by the elements and its relation to other elements in the page. On the bottom the box model applies different to HTML elements depending on how they are displayed. On HTML, you got 2 display modes for elements. You got the inline display mode and the block display mode, and I'll talk about it in a while. So first, the elements that conform to the block model are the ones above. You've got, for instance, the div that you use for layouts quite frequently. You got the header, you got the nav, you've got the table, you got the footer, You got all of these elements that, well, what happens when the display mode is blocked is that the element will take up all vertical, all horizontal space. The element will sort of be rendered in the following line, right? In the following line of text, taking up all space. That's what block mode is basically. How it behaves. Then you got the inline display mode that you see that textual elements such as the hyperlink or the text area or well, the span, the image. Well, the inline won't jump to the next line, will be rendered on the same line of text and won't attempt to take all space, right? So the block will take all space in a new line, and the inline will just render in the same line where it is declared. That's sort of a big difference among them. Here you got a straight comparison. So the block, in the block model, the box will break onto a new line. The box will extend in the inline direction to fill the space available in its container. In most cases, this means that the box will become as wide as its container, filling up 100% of the space available. The width and height properties are respected, and padding, margin, and border will cause other elements to be pushed away from the box. When you cut inline, the box will not break onto a new line. The box will, sorry, I pasted this twice. I'm sorry, I'll fix it. I don't like how it looks. Yeah. The width and height properties will not apply. The vertical padding, margins, and borders will apply, but will not cause other inline boxes to move away from the box. And horizontal padding, margins, and borders will apply and will cause other boxes to move away from the box. So you got differences between vertical padding and horizontal padding. When you want to declare your styles and use them with your HTML documents, you have several options. First, you got the possibility to write your styles in an external file with a CSS extension, which is the preferred way to do it. You should always attempt to save your style sheets as separate files to the HTML document. It's not a good practice to mix within one kind of document, within HTML document, mix CSS and HTML. Doesn't, for maintainability reasons, using external files is always preferred. You can also declare your style sheet internally within the HTML document, or you can even declare styles on a per element basis with inline styles, which is the bad practice I told you not to use, and I hope you don't use. So when you want to include an external style sheet, you use a link declaration, a link tag, like in these examples. You got the head tag, within the head tag you put a link tag, and you see there's an href attribute. That href attribute will tell where's the file. It's the path to the file. You got the type, which is text CSS. There's notation of having sort of the content type and the sort of extension with a slash in between. That's called a MIME type. So the MIME type in this case is text CSS. And the link is about the style sheet. So rel style sheet means it is a style sheet. In Rails, you have to use a helper in order to include an external style sheet. There's a style sheet link tag helper, which you call passing the name of the style sheet, and it will look for the style sheet in predefined locations. Usually, you save your style sheets within the app assets folder. If you take a look at an existing Rails project you have, you'll see that within the app folder there's an assets folder, and within the assets folder that's where you place your style sheets and also then your JavaScript code, as we'll see in a couple classes. Possibly next class, I think we'll cover some JavaScript. So the internal declaration works like this. You got your HTML document. Within the head, you place a style tag, a style element, specifying the type, which is in this case, of course, text CSS. And within the tag, you place your plain CSS code. So you got a mixture of CSS code and HTML. At the right side, you got the result of what's being done in the code. We're basically defining a style for H1, and below in the body, we've got an H1. So we got a red H1. Look at the color there. It's B0. That means that the red has a higher intensity than the green. The value of green is 1. And the blue value is 0. So we got high intensity of red or medium intensity of red, and that's what you see at the right. So don't repeat yourself. The dry principle does not belong in this kind of style sheet declaration. This style sheet declaration will apply to the page where it is defined and no other pages. Well, if you define it in a layout in Rails, well, it will be applied to all pages based on the layout, right? But anyways, it's not the best way to go. It's not the most maintainable way of writing and organizing your CSS. And finally, we've got the inline style declaration, which is the most disgusting, repulsive, I'd say. Let's not use it, okay? Here you got the style directly defined in the h1 element. You got the style attribute passing in the set of rules, and that's not really nice. You know, you can put many properties separated by a colon, by a semicolon, and that's not really nice. You know, you got a heading 1, and below you got a paragraph. Within the paragraph you got an inline element, which is a span, and the span will allow you to customize the color of the text. So there's a style word, which is colored with blue. So abusing this approach systematically is wrong on many levels. It's like an involution. I'm not quite sure if involution exists in English, but es una involución porque es como volver a los años 90 y poner el estilo en los tags de HTML. O sea, de punto de vista de la calidad, en verdad es muy precario hacer esto. Don't do it. So now I'll stop and see if there are any questions. Okay, no questions so far, so good. CSS is quite easy to follow, I think, so far. So there are units in CSS as to how to specify length. We've got many properties that take length values, such as the box model properties, the width, the margin, the padding, the font size. All of those properties will require some length measure. So length is specified by a number followed by a length unit. You have to put the number and the unit, the length unit, together, no space in between, otherwise it will be syntactically wrong. So 10 pixels or 2 EMs are valid measures. I'll explain about pixels and EMs in a minute. A white space cannot appear between the number and the unit. However, if the value is 0, the unit can be omitted because it doesn't matter which unit you want. 0 is always 0. For some CSS properties, negative lengths are allowed. And this kind of trickery was used to build layouts up to CSS version 2. CSS version 3 is way easier to use than the prior versions. So there are two types of length units, absolute and relative. Absolute is considering the coordinate system starting with 0, 0 at the top left, and relative is relative to the parent, the containing element. So you got the units with their descriptions here. I took this from W3 Schools, of course. You got a link below. So you got the centimeters, you got the millimeters, you got the inches, the pixels, and this is because CSS supports different media, as we'll see in a while. You know, CSS will support print media as well as screen-based media, etc. So you got traditional measures for printed media, and you got measures for screen media. Then you got, these are the absolute units. Then you got relative units. And relative because, for instance, in the first case, the EM unit is relative to the font size of the element. 2EM means 2 times the size of the current font being used wherever it is that you want your element EM to be customized. Then EX relative to the X height of the current font, which is rarely used. You got CH relative to a width of 0. Also, I think that's mostly for historical reasons. REM relative to the font size of the root element. So you got the VW relative to 1% of the width of the viewport. The viewport is what the user actually sees, is the browser window size. If the viewport is 50 centimeters wide, then 1 VW is 0.5 centimeters, because it's relative to 1%, always 1%. VW is for the width, VH is for the height, Vmin is for the 1% of viewport, smaller dimension, which can be the height or the width, depending on whether you're using a tablet or you're using a desktop computer, for instance. You got percentage, which is relative to a parent element as well, you know. So, okay, I've shown you concepts that are supported by CSS1 for the most part. All of these things are supported by CSS1. Then we got CSS2. CSS2 was published as a W3C recommendation back in May 1998. It is a superset of CSS1, including new element positioning capabilities such as absolute, relative, and fixed positioning of elements. It also added the float property to elements. That is the possibility for elements to float at the right or the left in the parent body. Or you can place an image inside a container and have other inline elements wrap around it, for instance. It's normally what you use. You can do this very easily in a word processor, right? But in the web, in web technologies in the late 90s, this wasn't available until CSS2 came out, I think. Or yeah, I think with plain HTML, no use of CSS2, it was also possible to do this. Yeah. Well, anyways, CSS2 also introduced sort of a way to stack elements, overlapping elements on top of each other, sort of prioritizing the elements. So if you got many elements on the same coordinates, you can choose what element to put on the top, for instance. So the C index property is intended for that. By the way, this float property and also the how do you say the alignment and the float and all that was a pain on the neck for web developers early on the 2000s. Really, it was plain suffering, and that's why there are so many memes such as the ones I showed you at the beginning of this part of the class. So there are selectors based on attribute values. That's an exception to what I shown you before. The selectors support based on attribute values are a CSS2 feature. The support for bidirectional text, that's for, I think, for Arabic or for Hebrew and also Western languages. The concept of media types to support Braille, embossed, handheld, print projection screen, terminal, TTI terminals, and TVs, televisions. There are new font properties such as shadows. However, well, all of these features are still available. The W3C no longer maintains this recommendation. So it won't be updated. Actually, it has been superseded by CSS3. So as I mentioned before, creating web layouts with CSS2 is difficult for many reasons. There's the fact that browser compliance and compatibility wasn't never really optimal. There are bugs on browser-specific rule behavior that back in the day had developers struggling to produce different style sheets for different browsers, for instance, and that's really a headache. So I'll give you a rule of thumb. Avoid creating your own layout with CSS2 techniques whenever possible. Run, just run. If someone asks you to do it, just run. And there are two compelling reasons for this. Nowadays, a substantial amount of web traffic comes from mobile users. In most cases, layouts should adapt to different form factors automatically. That's what we call responsive layouts. For instance, if you resize a browser window, then if you got a small window, the elements should display adequate as to be shown in a smartphone screen. And if you stretch the window, then the elements should move relocate in such a way that the document looks well on a wide screen on a computer, on a laptop, or in a desktop computer. And well, last nail in the coffin is that CSS2 is becoming obsolete. With the new features available on CSS3, as well as the wide browser support of the new features, CSS2 doesn't make sense to use its techniques for building your own layouts. Doesn't make sense. So CSS3 has a lot of history. Development began almost 20 years ago. It's way more complex than CSS2, and it has broken up into several different specifications called modules. Each module adds new capabilities or extends features defined in CSS2, preserving the backward compatibility. There were some notable features such as multi-column layouts, the flexible box layout known as the Flexbox, the grid layout, which is the most powerful layout model supported. In your project, you're likely to use Bootstrap. Bootstrap will use the CSS3 grid layout underneath. So you got new color modes, including RGB plus alpha, which enables transparency, and you got the hue, saturation, and lightness color model as well. You got the linear gradients, you got the radial gradients, you got the round corners, drop shadows, text shadows. You've even got queries in order to query the browser for feature support. So about the flexible box layout, yeah, optimistic memes, sort of happy memes started appearing when the Flexbox came out. The Flexbox is relatively recent. The candidate recommendation for Flexbox appeared about 3 to 4 years ago, and since then, it's been way easier for developers to create basic layouts on the websites. For instance, the layout I provided for you on Labs Assignment 7 uses the Flexbox, okay? So it's easy to implement. You see the few lines of code I provided you in a style sheet back then? You can easily code that yourself with no help of a designer. You can do it with the knowledge of an engineer. You know, you simply place boxes and that's it. Everything is squared. Everything is a rectangle. That's kind of engineering, how engineers think, right? I guess if you go to an engineering building, well, it will look like a set of blocks put together somehow. So the main idea behind the Flexbox layout is to give the container, the element container, so think again about the box, the ability to alter its items width and height and order to best fill the available space. So if you resize, the elements can relocate to accommodate all kinds of display devices and screen sizes. So it was a much needed solution to a problem that existed back with CSS2 that was was a great headache and a pain in the neck for web developers. The Flexbox layout CSS model, I mentioned this. Actually, it's the same slide, so I will delete it. I'm sorry about it. I copied and pasted. It often happens. So here's a demonstration of the Flexbox. At the right side, we've got the HTML. The HTML is simply a non-ordered list of elements. So each of the elements is contains a number, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, right? If we display this with no styling, it will be just a bullet list, a very rudimentary and boring bullet list. And by using style sheets and the Flexbox, we style each of the list items in such a way that it acquires the shape of a rectangle. It has fixed width and height. The flex item, you see, the flex item is a property that applies to the list items. Because they all have this class, this class. You see the class attribute here? Well, there's this notation in CSS. If you put a dot at the beginning of the selector, this means that this is intended for a class of elements, a class, right? So any element containing flex item on its class attribute will have these rules applied. So the background is tomato color, very interesting. The padding is 5 pixels. That applies to top, left, right, and bottom. The width is 200 pixels. The height is 150. The margin top is 10 pixels. The margin bottom, the line height is 150 pixels. Okay, the font color is white. The foreground color is white. The font weight is bold. The font size is 3 EMs, and the text alignment is center. So, okay, this is wonderful. So then we've got the container. There's a container, which is the list, which will contain all of these items. You define that the display mode of the container is flex to support the Flexbox. Then you have the elements flowing on a row fashion with wrapping. That means that if there's not enough space, elements 4, 5, and 6 show in a second line. If you stretch the space available, 4, 5, and 6 will appear after 3 to the right side. So, okay, there are other property sets that are specified in order to define how to distribute the remaining space. So the remaining space is simply space around the elements. And that's it. That's a result. Here's the link to the example. Okay, I can show that for you. I'll go back to your question about pixel density in a minute. All right, so the examples I think are quite down below in the page. Here are the examples. This is a wonderful guide, by the way. If you want to really understand the Flexbox, all the possibilities and how to use it, I encourage you to visit this page, A Guide to Flexbox, go through the different examples, and you will know what is possible to accomplish. So look, it happens just what I told you. If there's enough space for the blocks, the blocks will appear all in one line. If you stretch the available space, and I think you do that here. No, that's reducing the. Yeah, let me see how you stretch. Yeah, you go this. Yeah, you go like this. No. So then you got space for 4 at the top, 2 at the bottom. Then you got 3 at the top, 3 at the bottom, and then if you continue decreasing the width, you got sort of the space that's available in a smartphone screen, for instance. So this is how the Flexbox will look in a smartphone screen, and this is how it will look in a computer screen and a desktop screen. There are a few websites that implement this feature well. I don't know. I'll try to show you with La Tercera. Which is better than Emol, in my opinion. The web design and web technologies used are way better. In this case, La Tercera desktop version won't decrease its width as you resize the browser window. No, it won't respond positively to that change. But let's see if no, thank you. If we try to, let's see, resize this, I'll try to do it with the developer tools somehow. Let's see here. There's some way to adjust the resolution, which I'm missing. Here it is, above. So, okay, let's think, for instance, we've got, I don't know, 600 pixels. Yeah. Since there are separate style sheets, yeah, you got it. You got it. You got a single column of content now. This is a single column of content. Well, I'm sorry about this. Should put more vertical resolution, something like that. And look, it's kind of, we've got like one column here, one column of content. Then we've got it adjusts pretty well to the available width. You can double the width, and it adjusts very well. So that's what I like about La Tercera as an example to show you about this kind of responsive layout that can be accomplished by the Flexbox and also possibly with the grid layout model that I will show you in a minute. So I'll go now to your questions. I won't get what is an inline declaration. VW depends on the screen resolution or pixel density. Let's see, let's go back there. It's 1% relative to the viewport size. So it doesn't really matter whether it's the screen resolution or it doesn't matter whether it's the pixel density or the screen resolution. You take whatever screen measure, viewport measure you got available, and the VW will take 1% of that. Commonly in a computer screen, you've got when you got the pixel measure. The pixel measured is considered to be 1/96th of an inch because 96 dpi is taken as the standard measure. But if you got a screen, sort of a high resolution display, such as an Apple Retina display or something like that, what happens is that an actual pixel, an actual logical pixel, will take up many physical pixels to be displayed. So it's still sort of 96 dpi if you want, but stretched to the resolution that is available in the physical screen. Well, the difference between the display box the block model versus the inline model is that the inline is intended sort of, I will explain it in Spanish, ¿no? El inline es que un elemento inline no consume una línea de texto propia, o sea, no se salta una línea para abajo y toma el 100% el ancho. El inline se ajusta simplemente a donde está definido. Es fácil de ver con el ejemplo que mostré del inline style declaration acá. ¿Ya? Acá tienes un elemento inline que es el span. El span aplica directo al texto, no está saltándose a una línea nueva para abarcar el 100% del espacio disponible. ¿Ya? El H1 me parece que es block. El H1 siempre toma todo el espacio disponible y se salta una línea. ¿Ya? Entonces el H1 es block, el span es inline. ¿Ya? Esa es la diferencia grande que hay entre estas cosas. Voy a ir para adelante. I'll go forwards and I'll show you another example of the Flexbox. For instance, if you want to create a navigation bar, right? This is similar to what I did for you in Lab Assignment 7, okay? So we got, again, an unordered list, and we display this list horizontally with the different links as list items. And the interesting thing about this style is that it has different behavior depending on the width that is available, right? Explicit width indications, pixel width indications for small screens, medium screens, and large, right? So as always, the container, which is navigation, the class navigation, will be based on the flex model. It will have a row flow, and it will, I don't know, there's this justify content property, the flex end. I'm not quite sure about that one, but anyways, the result, you see it here small. I'll show it to you large. Here you got it. So if you resize this, yeah, if you resize it, it will look like how do you say, like a list, a downward list. Yeah, you got flex direction column. So it sort of builds a column with all the different elements. So if you got more space, you got the space around justification. Let's see. Yeah, you got sort of this intermediate behavior like this, you know. A max width 800 pixels. So I think this this applies to the second. The second case is being applied here. Yeah. Yeah, you're evenly distributing empty space around the items in this case. And in the first case, applying this to a large screen, yeah, you got the items aligned to the end line on main axis. So that's why you see the elements pushed to the right side. So the way in which you justify content will define how the content is finally aligned or displayed within the container. So, okay. Finally, the most complex example is the one we see here. This is a full-featured layout. You got a header, you got an aside for second-level navigation or first-level navigation because there's no navigation bar here. You got another aside that can be for advertising, and you got a footer. And then you got a main section which contains the content. So when the screen, when the viewport is sufficiently wide, the document will render as in the first case. If you narrow the viewport to I think it's 800 pixels. What happens is that the order is inverted. You know, first the main part comes before the aside. You know, here the aside comes before the main. When you got less horizontal space, it switches order. So that's sort of the basic behavior. And when you got even smaller width, it's best that I show you the actual example. Let's see about it. Here you got it. yeah, finally, the end result is having a column. You start stretching this, and it evolves up to a full featured layout with 3 columns, a header and a footer. So the sort of specifics about it, the science about it, I suggest you see for yourself. Follow this guide and try to research about the order property, for instance. Well, anyways, it's quite likely, I think, the most practical thing to do, to use a library such as Bootstrap to implement styles on your website. So now about the grid layout. The grid layout is more flexible, more complex than the Flexbox. It is intended for a large layout, such as the layout at La Tercera. The La Tercera layout is quite intricate. It has many different columns, many different column sets and containers and things. So I'll to show you what is possible to do with a grid. Well, there are further things possible. There are more things possible, but I can the model works pretty much like a table. You got rows and you got columns, and you can size your divs. You see the HTML, it's packed with divs. You got many divs packed into a wrapper. So you got a wrapper that has a grid display mode, and then you got each of the elements with different classes, right? So each class will define the behavior, not actually the behavior, but the positioning and the dimensions of each div element in relation to the grid. So you got the element 1 that will take 2 columns. Actually, these numbers here show the grid line numbers. So you have to think about this as a grid. You got here 1 line, another line here. So it's like you got 4 vertical lines, and then you got I think it's starting here. You got the first line here, the end line there, and you got intermediate lines. So I don't know how many lines you got here. You got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You got like 5 lines. So this will tell sort of the range that should be covered by an element, both horizontally and vertically. And you can specify which column, in which column it should be displayed. For instance, we got 4, the grid column is 3, grid row is 3. This one is easy because it only takes 1 cell, but other elements that take more cells are accommodating and by specifying the grid lines they take. There are, of course, a wide set of libraries and tools to incorporate CSS on your website. It's almost every day new technologies appear for facilitating this. Fortunately, nowadays it's way easier to use CSS than it was 20 years ago or 15 years ago. I recommend in this course that you use the Bootstrap library. So have a look at the tutorial, have a look at the documents, the docs on how to use it. You already know the basics about CSS. You know about selectors, you know about properties. That's pretty much all you have to know in order to understand how Bootstrap works. Actually, Bootstrap will add a few other concepts, such as the 12 column model, which is the way in which the elements will basically be accommodated, sort of in a grid fashion. So the guide is easy to follow, easy to understand. You basically need containers. You place rows within the containers, and then you place your elements taking up space with columns. It's sort of an entirely row column box kind of arrangement of the elements. Easy to use, really. Have a look at the documentation and you will be amazed at how easy it is to accomplish seemingly complex styling in your web pages. There are other tools that will augment, that will enhance the basic CSS features. In large projects, plain CSS can get difficult to organize. It can be very difficult to sort of tidy up your styles because there can be too many rules, too many rules, and having a monolithic style sheet, an extremely large style sheet, will make it difficult to debug, difficult to maintain, as it is with all other software there is. So one way to achieve modularity, to template your styles, and to get many sort of programmatic flexibility with your style sheets is to incorporate a tool such as Sass. Sass is a style sheet language that compiles to CSS, that has programming capabilities. There's we could say it's an improved variant of Sass, which is known as SCSS. SCSS is a superset of CSS that supports all Sass features, and it's preferred by web developers nowadays because it has the same CSS syntax. Sass doesn't have the exact CSS syntax. SCSS does have that syntax, so it's preferable. And lastly, there's a technology which is called Less. Less is based on JavaScript. Sass is based on Ruby. On Rails, I think, well, you'll use Sass anyway. If you come to use a preprocessor, it's rare that you'll use it in this course because that's sort of a more advanced topic that we don't have sufficient time to cover. But if you want to research about it, it's quite likely that Sass will be the tool you'll be using, the one you'll have at hand to do things if you want, you know, because, well, Bootstrap is based on Sass, and it's all you need on this course. Last topic we'll start covering now. It's a long topic, so we'll cover it partially in this class. There's some more time you will need. Actually, lab 8 will require you to implement web forms, but at a basic level. We won't go too deep into the functionality that is possible to accomplish with web forms. So don't be too worried about this. If we don't cover all content, I will cover sufficient content in order for you to be able to use the web forms in Rails. So HTML defines several elements that can be used to compose forms. Forms are very common for allowing the user to input data. For instance, if you think of any resource there is in your application, it is most likely that a user will need to enter information to create resource instances and also to update them. So for that to work from a web browser, you'll need to provide web forms. So HTML forms usually contain text fields, checkboxes, radio buttons, submit buttons, field sets, labels, and a few other items. But the first I mentioned are the most common. So a form can be defined specifying the form tag, and the form tag will usually specify an action attribute. Look at the example below. You got form tag opening there, you got an action attribute. Look at the action attribute value. It's a path. The path is /groups. And the form declares an HTTP method with which it works, which is a post method. So you're posting to the groups path. And if you look, if you remember from routing, if you remember from RESTful, resourceful routing, when you got that kind of path and you've got that kind of action, that kind of method or action equivalently, I think, no, it's the HTTP method, you got post, you are basically creating a new group. That is what this form is for. You're creating a new group. A group is a resource available in some application. So you got a form that will allow to create a new group. And that's easily that is easy to see if you pay attention to the action and the method. So the controller that will be run, because thinking about this as a Rails application, it's a groups controller, and the action will be the create action. So the method attribute specifies the HTTP method get or post to be used when submitting the form data. There's two possibilities when you submit forms. You can use the get method or you can use the post method. So the get method will have the data being visible in the page's field address field. In the web browser, you'll see all the data in the address bar. The length of the URL is limited to 2 kilobytes or 2048 characters. So there's a limited amount of data you can send with a form if you use the get method. Never use the get method to send sensitive data as it will appear on the address bar. It is useful for form submissions where a user who wants to bookmark the results, such as a web search engine. It is better for non-secure data like query strings in Google, for instance. Then you got the post method. Always use the post method if the form data contains sensitive or personal information. The post method will not display the form data in the page address field. It has no size limitations, And however, the submissions, the form submissions with post can't be bookmarked. You can't bookmark a form you are submitting with posts so that the form shows again the same data as before, even though that is a browser function. The browsers will allow you to remember what you entered in a form, right? That's a web browser feature more than anything else. There's a target attribute available for web forms. The target attribute will tell whether there's a need to open a new tab or a new browser window when the form is submitted to show the result of submitting the form. The default value of this attribute is self_self, which means that the response will appear on the same browser window on the same tab. If you want to show the response on a new browser tab or window, tab nowadays, new windows are a thing of the past. Nowadays we use browser tabs. You use _blank. So this is a summary of all attributes supported by web forms. You see that the action, method, and target are the ones that are the ones which we just saw. There are other ones. So you can specify a name for the form. You can specify that the browser shouldn't validate the form with no validate. You can specify custom encodings for the submitted data, which are different ways to serialize the form data. Rails will support the default, which is URL encoded. That means that the form data will be encoded in the same format as a query string in a URL. That is a series of key value pairs separated by ampersands, that kind of serialization. Autocomplete, you can enable it or disable it for the browser. And you got the char set that is acceptable by the form. So if you want to simply use the default option, nowadays Unicode, and the user will be able to enter whatever characters he wants. They want actually to use inclusive language. Any character the users might want. Then a very important element in forms is the input element. The input element can have several different types. You got different input types. You can input text. You can input a binary value, sort of a dichotomic value with a checkbox. The checkbox will allow you to select multiple options. That's what a checkbox does. You can have an array of checkboxes However, each checkbox is intended for a dichotomic option. Yes. Then you got the radio buttons, and the radio buttons have mutually exclusive options. You select one at a time. You got a color picker. You got a date picker depending on the browser, on browser support, date capability, browser capability. It will show a pop-up window with a calendar, for instance. That's a browser, a feature that's available in the web browser. You got email address fields that can be validated by the browser. Actually, you for this kind of data, you perform validation both in the browser and in the server side, as we saw back in the day when we were studying validation with Active Record, right? And you can also have hidden input elements that will contain hidden data that can be meaningful to your application, to your controller. If you want to pass a variable that's hidden with a value and you want to make a decision in your controller about that variable, you can do it with a hidden input form element. So there are several attributes that can be specified in the input element depending on the type attribute. If you got a text, it can have a max length. It can have a size in available characters that are possible to be seen at the time. It can be read-only, it can be disabled. It will have a value. The value property will allow you to retrieve the value. Later on, when we use JavaScript, you'll use that. You can specify whether the element is the input is required or not, whether it will autofocus, that is when the page opens up and renders, okay, the element will be focused so that the user can type right in there without having to manually focus the element itself. Well, you got autocomplete and so on. You got many different attributes that are possible to define. You can even define irregular expression patterns to validate form input. Then you got the text area. The text area is a text field that can allow multiple lines of text. You can set the rows and calls properties that will sort of set the dimensions of the text area element. You got a button element that is a clickable button. You got a field set that is an element used to group many other fields. You got a legend that will define the caption, the sort of title that will be displayed on a field set. You got a data list that is a set of predefined options for an input element. For instance, if you want to provide the user with the user starts typing and then you want to hint the user on the options, you use a data list for that. You got the output element, which is rarely used and is intended for computation. When you want to calculate something and display the result, you use output. Another very important form element is the select, which will present the user with a list of options. Within the select tag, there are nested option tags that define each of the options in the list. You can even group the options to make it easier for the user to select the related options. You should look at the tutorial at W3 Schools to see a few examples of this. It's very likely that you will be using select boxes in the next lab. So Rails will allow you to use all of these form elements, all of these form tags that are available in HTML. And for that, there's an entire guide devoted to document, to explain how you use forms in Rails. And we will now review some of the different helpers that are available to produce forms in Rails. We'll start with the most basic. We got, well, it's not actually the most basic. This is perhaps the flexible way of doing things. You know, you got the form width helper, as we see here, the first line of the embedded Ruby code. You see that the form width will generate a form with first the URL is meant to be rendered as the action. See below the HTML, and you'll see that the search path is finally the action path of the form that gets rendered. The method for this form is get. So it's a search form. It's a form to search for something. And you see that within the form with declaration, there's a form label declaration. See that at the end of the line here, you got a Ruby block, and you got a block variable. The block variable that is yield after this is the form variable. So you attach elements to the form by using this variable. You put this variable here, and you put dot label, and that means that you want to place a label on the form that will have a certain ID and a name. The name and ID is Q, and it will have a label, right? I mean the label is intended for the text field with a name and ID Q. Sorry. So the label is simply text. The search for will appear as text. Will be rendered as text, and next to the text field will appear. And the text field will automatically get an ID attribute and a name attribute with a specified value, which is Q. And finally, we've got a submit button. There you got it. It's an input type submit. That is a submit button in the form, which will show search text. It's a button that it's labeled as search, and will submit the form to the server. Then we've got the checkbox and label tags. You know, these are helpers to produce checkboxes and label, as you see below. So when you give a name here, when you give an argument, this name argument will be rendered as the ID and the name. And we'll see the difference among these in the next lab, right? The name is what you put on the input, right? The name is what you put in the input, so that in the controller, in the params, you get the value, right? You in the form, you must have a name always, and you must have a value, right? The ID is intended for other things. The ID is intended for style customization, for instance, or for interactivity with JavaScript. So the ID is intended for the browser, the name is intended for the server. So if you put the pet dog, then the value of the checkbox will arrive at the controller action, and you will be able to retrieve it by using the params hash. And there are many helpers available, right? You got the text area, the password field tag, the hidden field tag. You got helpers which have a tag suffix in the name, which are not meant to work with model objects. Okay, and then you got a great amount of fields which are intended to work with model objects, as we will see in a minute. So if you look at how these helpers render, what HTML is rendered, you'll see that, well, this is simply a password field. The name is password. You go in the controller action to params password, and you get whatever the user entered in the password field. You then have fields that have this kind of notation: username, user phone, user born. These are actual model attributes. These are model attributes. The model is called user. The model variable is called user. And these are attributes of the user model. So then when you retrieve the values in the controller action with params, you have to refer to the user. So you have to you remember about the strong parameters. You have to enable, you have to permit the user parameter, and within the user parameter, each of these scalar properties. You know, you got the username, which is a scalar property. You got the phone, which is a scalar property as well, a scalar value, and so on. So all of these will have a user in the name, and within square brackets, the name of the attribute that for which the data, for which the parameter is being set on the form. Right, so a particularly common task for a form is editing or creating a model object. In this case, one approach is to use form text lacking the tag suffix, as we showed previously. So you got text field person name like this, and you got the rendered HTML in which the ID is person name, and the name is person square brackets name. That means that the name is an attribute of a person object, of a person model, right? So in the controller, you take the person objects, and you take the name scalar property in order to, well, you can do whatever you want. You can do mass assignment of the parameters and so on. So the way this works is that in your controller action, you must have some model objects being created or instanced. In this case, we're creating a form for the new action. The new action will always return the user in a web browser a form on which the user can enter the data to create a new resource. So in this case, we're creating a new article. You got, in this case, a form for the article model. You specify form with model. The model, you see the article object there. You see there's a certain CSS, a certain class being specified for the form, possibly for styling with CSS. Then you got the form variable again, and you attach the different input types: the text field for title, the text area for the body with a certain size property, and a submit button. And this will render as you see here. And you'll see that there's the article model and the different attribute variables. And I'll show you just one more thing to end the class. I'm sorry, it's already 10:20. I'll try to just show you this because I think it is important. There are forms for resources. When you declare a resource in your routes.rb file, such as resources articles, you'll see that you got an automated way of producing a form for the resource. So you can use this short style declaration, form with model article, and it will create a form that contains the different fields that are necessary to populate the different attributes of article. It's not the best way to go because you can't customize really the different fields, you know. It's most likely that you want to add some custom styling to the different form input elements or behavior, you know. So this is actually a shorthand just to get some obra gruesa, if you will, done. But if you want to fine-tune your form, then you should use this kind of approach in which you declare each of the input elements. So this is more specific. This is forms for resources that have nesting, nested resources. Or actually, this is for namespaces, when you use namespaces, sorry. So you got one level of namespaces. In that case, you specify the model together with the namespace. Before comes the namespace, then the model. If you got two levels of nesting with your namespaces, you put the hierarchical levels first and then the model objects. Okay, so normally in web browsers, support for patch and put is not available. Web browsers will only support get and post, as HTTP methods. So patch, put, and delete are simulated, are just simulated. And what happens is that the form, let's see if we got an example here. Yeah, unfortunately we don't have an example, but anyways, what happens is that if you got a form to update an object, the form will automatically have a hidden input named method, which will be set to reflect the desired method. For instance, if you want to patch, the method input field, which is hidden, will take whatever method you want to finally be executed by the controller. Okay, so it is simulated by using a hidden variable telling whether you want to use patch, put, or delete. So prepare for Lab 8. Here are all the references. Study CSS at W3 schools. There's some styling you'll do to a web form. You'll also need to study about the Rails form helpers. Have some clarity on that because you'll build forms for possibly events or ticket types and so on. So you'd like to be comfortable with that. And it will be all about styling and forms at a basic level. And we won't go too deep about it. And later on in the project, it's possible that you will add more interesting features. So that's all for today. Thank you very much for watching this class. Please forgive the 3 minutes, extra 3 minutes I took. It's actually, I started like 2 or 3 minutes late and ended 2 or 3 minutes late. So I actually made a good estimation of time estimation for this class. Okay, I see there are no questions. I think, well, if you got any questions about the project, I just answered a few emails you've sent me over the last couple of days. I'm sorry I couldn't do this before. I've been extremely busy lately. But I hope I can cope with the remaining emails I got, which is I think just one email. I got like one email left. So if you got more questions, you can write me and I'll try to get back to you today, Friday. On the weekend is of course a little more difficult, but tomorrow, Saturday, I'll be working. Unfortunately, I have to work on Saturday morning, but given that I will be working, it's quite likely I have space to reply to your emails. So thank you very much for watching this class today. I haven't seen the attendance. Now it's we're almost finished with the class. We're pretty much finished. There's not too many people watching this concurrently, I'm afraid. What I like to see is that you like watching this later on. These classes seem helpful for you to watch later on, as I've seen with the video statistics. You tend to watch this after the official time of the class, and that's totally all right. If you are really interested in this course, it's best that you come in the morning and watch the class, and then you can watch the videos, right? Anyways, I wish you best luck with your project assignment. Hopefully on Monday you'll be able to finish it. We'll see if we give you more time, but possibly with a penalty. Anyways. Let's stay in touch. Just tell me whatever doubts you may have, and I'll try to get back to you as soon as I can. About the project, the routes, we must use namespace API or do namespace. I think I told you about it in the statement. For an API, you should have a separate set of routes, and the proper way of doing that is to create a namespace for those routes. All right, so I'll finish now. I'll just end the transmission. Thank you very much for watching again, and see you next Friday. In the meantime, in between, we can still get in touch. Bye-bye.